Hello everyone, welcome to Internally Screening. You join us once more for Hooptober, and today we are reviewing The Endless from 2017, directed by Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead. It focuses around two brothers who were ex-members of this kind of doomsday cult, and they get a mysterious tape recording through their door one day, and it kind of entices them back to that previous cult that they had once left. They are all still alive and kicking, but things are spooky and mysterious. But while one brother is very skeptical, the other is more open-minded, and there's this kind of difficult relationship between them as more and more unusual things unfold in the camp, and they discover more and more mysteries the further and further they dig. So Rupert, I'm going to pass this to you. What do you think of The Endless?
I found it a little bit frustrating, to be honest. I can't say I really liked it all that much, but I do respect thematically what the film was going for. I respect that it was made for under $1 million dollars, and has so many sort of high-minded concepts, and kind of explicitly states that it's like trying to be. Because I think there's like some opening text which is like a quote from Lovecraft or something like that, right?
Yes, it is, yeah.
I respect the effort on that. I don't think it really succeeded in being very Lovecraftian at all.
Okay.
But whilst I didn't really enjoy it, and I found it sort of amateurish in spots, I did think it was like quite an original film in that way. That did very well with its limitations. In its actors, its sets, and especially its special effects, which obviously which sort of gradually become more and more pronounced as the film goes on.
I would say that's a core thing to kind of bear in mind with this film, and one that didn't really rear its head in the sort of production values I found is those limitations. Like the fact that it's such a small budget film and yet it looked as good as it did.
It's very well shot.
I think the cinematography is very good. The effects were, I kind of liked the minimal, like you say, it builds up through the film, and kind of that minimalist style of the effects early on really helps build you into this kind of suspicious, paranoid narrative of like, are these things really happening? Is it all kind of sort of inexplicable, coincidental, natural phenomenon? In fact, even what I quite liked in terms of like the narrative of the film is that a lot of the cult members don't even sort of will offer natural solutions to the reasons certain things are happening. It's not the kind of level of them being brainwashed is quite subtle and makes it all the more kind of sneaky and subversive like that, which I liked. It, the relationship between the cult and the brothers is not as sort of diametrically opposed as one would imagine it being in a more clumsy film. I
think the relationship between the brothers is probably the best element of the film to me, and kind of what their ideas are. That was the main thing that kind of had me thinking throughout the film.
Okay.
And I guess it's interesting. It's the two directors who play the main characters, which is quite interesting. And they're both pretty good actors as well. Probably the best in the film, in my opinion. It feels like very real. Look, I've never been in a cult, so I don't know what it's like. But I thought the dynamic between them was quite interesting, because you kind of have the one brother who is quite dead set. He's like, we were in this fucking weird cult. They did all this weird shit. And we got to actually try and live in the real world. And then the other brother is kind of thinking and sort of outright saying at points like, well, yeah, it was kind of a bit weird, but is it actually that much worse to sort of live, in this kind of weird denial of reality in a sense? And is our life actually better now that we've left the cult?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they don't seem to be in a particularly good financial or social situation.
Yeah,
they seem
which
quite
must
isolated.
be a real thing, right? It made me think, like, if you're in a cult like Scientology or something, and you're like quite high up, right? It's probably a very comfortable existence in many regards. Like, you have all these people who respect you and look up to you, or you have this kind of comfort of community.
Yes.
And all you have to do is it's kind of deny reality on several levels, which is kind of a core fundamental of a cult.
Yeah.
And you do get quite a cushy experience in life.
Oh yeah, and that's part of what lures people in. Yeah. And then preys upon people like that.
Once you're out of that, not only do you lose all that community, but your life becomes a lot more complicated. and difficult to deal with, which I think is like a really interesting idea. And I think the way that they developed that relationship through the brothers and explored that idea was actually pretty good.
Yeah, I wasn't so convinced by the two brothers, largely because I actually don't agree that their acting was all that brilliant. I completely agree with you that thematically and all the things we were discussing are really well explored, but I think there's a lot of kind of clumsy dialogue, and the performances, I remember thinking,
I'm not saying they. I thought the performances were great.
Good by the standard of the film.
I thought they were better than all the other actors.
That's fair. I think that is where the limitations of the budget really rear their heads. Is in the performances. I think it is very kind of Amdram level stuff. But I do think that spreads to the brothers a fair amount. But more so when I think actually they're interacting with one another. I think the younger brother, I'm not sure which of the directors plays him, but the blonde brother, he definitely was a bit weaker to me, and it was definitely that when they were together there were a few sort of lines of dialogue that just felt a bit awkward and a bit like tonally separate from a lot of what else was going on. There were a couple of sort of weird off lines that just didn't mesh. And yeah, I remember kind of before I knew that the directors were the main actors, I actually had that question in my head of like, why were these guys picked as the main kind of guys? They're not particularly brilliant, and I was like, okay, well that all kind of makes sense now. And again, I respect it's a limitation. It's like, it's easy. You tick that's one thing you don't have to worry about on your budget. Is like we're the writers, the actors, producers,
you have to
directors.
waste time explaining the script to the actors.
Exactly, it's done, dusted, move on, and it's not unbearable. The performances are just a bit kind of middle of the road, and the dialogue does let it down in places, but I think there are points later on in the film where the brothers are separated and like they're kind of going on their own sort of journeys, particularly the older brother, the brown haired brother. I much preferred those moments where he was kind of going on his own little personal journey. I think he was much better in those moments.
I just think in terms of the performances in this film and the sort of general tone, it's really hard to pin down exactly what it is that bothers me.
Yeah.
But there's something just slightly off with not just the performances, like the way the lines are written. It kind of has this, I don't know if it's a failed attempt at naturalism, like sort of have this kind of very casual, everyone kind of talks to each other like, yeah, remember this, bro, blah, blah, blah. But there's also this kind of heightened element to it. It just felt weirdly off-putting. I don't know what it was.
Yeah, like I kind of know what you're getting at.
Yeah, like it just didn't feel... I never kind of settled into any kind of atmosphere in the film, if that makes sense. And this feels like a film that should be very heavy on the atmosphere.
For sure.
Especially if it's trying to go for something Lovecraftian.
Yeah.
Because I think about a recent Lovecraftian film that I saw was The Colour Out of Space with Nick Cage. And that's like quite a good Lovecrafted adaptation in that it doesn't actually really try and do like Lovecraftian horror.
Okay.
It kind of just... It's like, no, we're just going to make a simple horror film. We're going to do the bits that we can do really well and kind of focus on that. Whereas this kind of felt like it was shooting for something much kind of deeper and higher.
Much grander, yeah.
And didn't quite reach those heights.
I think there are spots. I think there are moments where they do. And I think some things can be quite... some of the simpler moments can be quite effective. One thing that's in the trailer and stood out in the film as well is the moment where they're doing like this kind of exercise where the group gathers around and they do like this sort of tug of war with this unseen thing, and one brother's really kind of dismissive and he's like, oh, there's just a dude up a ladder like the other end, and you're like, oh, okay, whatever. But then the actual process of it, things get more kind of murky and interesting, like, and it has you questioning how much of it can really be put down to realistic explanations and things like that. There was some quite it was subtly effective, I think, in those moments. And there's parts as well later on, I guess, if we start venturing into some spoilery territory, so spoilers from here on, there's a really cool bit where we kind of get to a more central location in amongst this kind of area of the desert that they inhabit, that they're kind of in like this sort of forest clearing, like they're in the center of it and there's woodland all around, and they find this like old tent, and they have like this there's
man, like a guy stuck in a time loop.
There's a guy stuck in this loop and he just keeps dying over and over and over again, and sort of reincarnating. And there's something really sort of specific and uncomfortable about that kind of imagery used in that scene. I really liked that.
I like the idea of that more than it didn't actually. I guess this is the core problem with the film. It never really unsettled me. Like, I know what you mean. Like, I like the idea of that. Like, in principle, when you describe it, it's like, wow, that does sound kind of spooky or interesting. But the way the film, it just didn't strike me. Maybe that's just because at this point in the film, I'd already kind of
checked out a bit.
Not checked out, but just like, I'm just not enjoying. I realised, like, this film I'm not enjoying. And then you have that bit, and it is an interesting idea, and I kind of like. It's like some of the concepts that this film introduces are interesting. Like, there's like people stuck in time loops, and you have this kind of separation sheen thing where like you're in the same area and you can cross it easily and whatever, but you can't see through it. It's like you can't see the people through it.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
It's a little bit like Annihilation in that kind of, you've got like this
yeah.
sort of dome, this shimmer kind of thing.
And like I thought, like, oh, that's a really interesting concept. Like, I wonder if they're going to do anything with that, and they kind of don't really do much with it.
Yeah,
like,
the main thing is that the brothers, because they've been there less time, they can kind of pass through.
Yeah, they can see,
like people who are stuck in their own little bubbles aren't able to kind of.
Yeah, and I thought like, oh, that would be quite interesting. But I guess for me, ultimately, my main complaint of the film is I just don't think the film does a whole. I don't find the relationships within the characters all that interesting either, because with a film like this, you kind of have this like slight sort of ensemble cast where you have, they come back and there's this girl that one of them's clearly like quite into, and like they have this relationship, and there's like this whole thing like, oh, they haven't really aged, like that's weird, like and then you have this guy who's clearly like sees himself as like a bit of a cult leader and is kind of like trying to climb the ladder a bit, and has this kind of cynical element to him. On paper, all that stuff is like, that's a good start for like something kind of interesting that you could do, but ultimately just doesn't really amount to all that much. I mean, this film kind of reminded me a little bit in the sort of cult element and where it's set. The film I don't think you've seen called Safe by Todd Haynes, where Julianne Moore becomes convinced that she's sick and ends up sort of going into this health cult in the desert. And like it's not a very similar film in any other way, but it actually kind of gives a quite interesting look into like why someone might go to a cult, whereas this is kind of more about why someone would leave a cult, if that makes sense. And it just kind of, I don't really feel like the film gets its full thesis across with these characters. They just kind of, they're all there for a bit, and then it kind of feels like it artificially ramps up the tension towards the end with this like third moon is going to ascend them into a time loop or something. Yeah, well, the idea, I think the idea at the end is that the third loop completes the time loop something for them, like that, the people in the middle, and then everything comes back around. It's also quite opaque, like oblique. The film, I can't really understand. Towards the end. We've mentioned this before in some reviews, that some films use ambiguity as a crutch. Yes. And it did feel like that was the case in this one. It felt like the writers came up with questions that were really interesting and then didn't have the answers themselves. And rather than leaving a kind of empty space where an answer did exist, it felt like the answer didn't exist, and they left that empty space because they couldn't fill it themselves. Yeah, because when you're writing an ambiguous film, you never have to reveal what it is, but I feel like the person who's writing it should have not like it is this literal thing, but like have a really strong idea of what this ambiguity, if that, I don't know how to describe it, like when you're writing it, you should know, like, even if the characters never figure it out, this is like my general thing, absolutely, because it's a character's exploration of a world, right? And the writers should have a really concrete understanding of what that world really is. Sometimes the answers aren't all that fulfilling, right? And sometimes that's why the ambiguity is more interesting, because it allows you to explore other avenues than just the pure correct one. But there should at least be these kinds of concrete templates of what those possibilities could be. And in this film, obviously, it's kind of, we are presuming the intentions and the capacity of the writers to achieve those things and suggesting that they haven't, in fact, worked those things out. I guess what I would say is that it doesn't feel like they have. The film doesn't get across. I'm not accusing them of being hacks. No, not at all. Like, I think, when you've been this bold in trying to create something, it's definitely admirable, and I think they've succeeded in it several places, and we'll come back to some of those. But yeah, the overall feeling is just that there wasn't much more to the core of this film than aesthetic and atmosphere, essentially. That's the difficult balance that comes with Lovecraftian horror, right? Because Lovecraftian is supposed to kind of be shorthand for a cosmic
unknowable kind of horror, almost being completely incomprehensible and unknowable to a human mind. And so sometimes a Get Out for a writer can be like, oh yeah, well, you just couldn't understand, you could never understand what the truth of these sorts of things are. But I think a film that handles this sort of idea much better is something like The Empty Man, which we saw a couple of years ago, which again sort of explores cult dynamics and one man investigating his way through it. But the reveal of what the film has going on underneath the surface actually heightens all the horror that was going on.
But I guess in a sense they're kind of similar, because I think the problem with this film is it actually does go quite in depth in explaining some of the mechanics of what is actually going on.
Well, yes, mechanics and what is happening, but not why it's happening.
Yes. Whereas with The Empty Man, I guess it's just, well, for a start, The Empty Man is just a much, much better film.
Yes.
But it also, even though when you're watching the film you don't know till right at the end, there's actually a lot of really specific like plot mechanics that are happening that you're just like not aware of until the end, and then when it all clicks into place in the end you're like, oh wow, oh fuck, this is like, you know, dark and fucked up and whatever. If you watch that film for the second time, if you were paying attention the first time, you can like, oh, this is happening here.
Yes.
Because I know that. Whereas I don't get the sense that I would feel that watching this again.
Yeah, I kind of know what you mean.
Like, I just...
Almost like the writers were figuring it out as they went along a bit.
Maybe. Like, I don't know.
They just didn't have like those kind of... This film is kind of one of like jigsaw pieces kind of clicking together, but there's like a few pieces missing, perhaps.
It just feels... I mean, the prime word coming to my mind right now when I think of this film is it just feels a little bit undercooked. Like it was kind of lacking a direction in a sense, because you kind of have this like cult thing going on, but I don't feel like the relationship between that and then like what's actually going on is ever like really investigated. Like, you know, if you're going to focus more on like what's actually going on, like what is this like entity or this, you know,
this force or whatever
loop thing, because it's like, I know that they're like multiple moons or something, right? And it's like, well, what's going on there? And they kind of explain that a bit. And because I found, you know, while watching it, I found it so unrewarding, like looking into all that stuff and thinking about it, I kind of ended up focusing on the more sort of plain intricacies of the film, which is just like the performances and then sort of like, you know, that CGI fire looks shit. Do you know
Well, I think that's coming back to things that I think the film did do right or better is I much preferred when this sort of second act shifts focus to these time loop sections where we kind of get this big info dump to the older brother from a man who lives out in his cabin. He goes in and there's this kind of really bizarre offbeat moment that I found quite effective, where he goes into this guy's room thinking he's in there. He's like, I know you're in there. He knocks, and then he opens the door and the guy's like he's hung himself, and he's like, what the fuck? And then the same guy appears out the back of shot and is like, what the fuck are you doing? And appears with his gun. And it's like this really unsettling thing is, we're like, is this guy seeing things? Is he having sort of visions of the future?
That was a good moment, and that's kind of what I wanted more from the film. Like when they established the time loop thing, I was like, that's like kind of the only time I kind of felt like they actually really engaged that. Like in the same way that I kind of was hoping they'd do something with this thing in the lake, or with this...
Or like the time loop in the middle.
Yeah, or the weird shimmer door. Like, are you going to do something scary with that? But that's kind of the only moment I can think of.
Yeah. But I mean, this kind of crazy, rambling hick kind of character who sort of comes in and is like starts to like fuck with him. He's clearly a little bit...
Doesn't he like lock him up?
No, he doesn't. But he's like a sort of level of antagonism to him where he's like annoyed essentially that this guy can move through the shimmer freely and he's trapped in this very minuscule little bubble, and he's like, well, basically what I do to try and like remove myself from the loop is kill myself every time, but it never works. I'm still stuck here, and I'm, you know, whatever this force is keeping me here in some sick game. And then he kind of sets him on his path. I really like that little vignette, and then the next you get another vignette which features some pretty ropey dialogue, if you ask me, but it's still kind of an interesting exploration into the like time loop thing, where we get the gun nut who is addicted to like heroin or crack or something, and he's tied up in the house. Do you remember this? That's the house where at the end of it they set fire to it. They have this whole exchange, and then he leaves, and then he sees the time loop reset where this second character comes to the place, and like the characters are all sort of in their starting positions again. I think that's all really interesting stuff. It feels like I said, vignettes. and then those vignettes don't really sort of connect fully into the finale.
It does feel a bit like a patchwork mosaic, cool ideas that were thrown in there. And I don't want to accuse the writers of being lazy, because I mean they wrote a film, I fucking haven't. So fair play. But I didn't like it, and yeah, it didn't really come to a particularly satisfying ending. I guess it's sort of satisfying to see when the brothers were sort of towards the end where everything's blowing up and shit.
Yeah, and they bond.
Yeah, and then they kind of say the themes of the film out loud, which to me were the most interesting elements of the film.
Yeah.
And then it just kind of ends. Yeah. And, yeah. That's it, really.
Well, I mean, having said all that, what would you give The Endless?
I'm between a 4 and a 5, but yeah, I'm not a huge fan.
I'd probably go with a 5 as well. As we've been saying, commendable for its boldness and for its sort of lofty ideas, but in execution, it's pretty lacking. The performances are pretty mediocre to subpar. Some of the dialogue's pretty ropey as well.
Yeah.
But some of the aesthetics and visuals and concepts are really appealing, and I can see someone becoming very invested in this film because of all the sort of unanswerable things and the kind of the detail in which you could kind of try and piece everything together. On our end, we think it's a little unfinished, but perhaps that unfinished quality could appeal more to other viewers. So
I'm sure it's got a cult following already. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I think it does, and the irony of it having a cult following. So it's not a total no recommend from us, but if you want to see kind of Lovecraftian horror, I think there are a couple of films like The Colour Out of Space.
I wouldn't class this as a Lovecraftian horror. I think.
Well, it's trying to be, right?
Sure.
And it's in that canon, even if it's not a particularly brilliant version of it. And The Empty Man would be another recommendation for me ahead of this film. But that's our review of The Endless. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. If you dislike the video, give it a dislike and let us know what you think of The Endless down in the comments. I've been Adam.
I've been Rupert.
And we've been Internally Screening. We'll catch you again soon. Peace.
Peace.